right to our opening remarks.
Yes. So much of what I said really earlier is really a good introduction, I think, for Justin, because Justin Reich is the educational researcher, and he's also the executive director of the Teaching Systems Lab at MIT. And he has done a lot, I think, in philosophically and also in his research to uncover some of the ways in which we can relate to each other very well using the internet, using the modern technology that's available to us. And he really is a leader in the field in terms of shaping how educators are approaching the use of this technology, and also how communities can be organized around using media and technology around the world. So we have an international sensibility as well as a local sensibility, and they aren't in conflict, but they are often different. And I think, so I'll turn it over to Justin and have him give us a wonderful keynote.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing?
Great.
Good. Nice to have you here. Thank you for having me. Welcome to MIT. I thought what I would do with my time this morning is talk to you all about how I and some of my colleagues here, some of my colleagues in the other organizations that I work with, think about what's worth learning in a complex world. And so for those of you who are educators, I think a lot of what I will talk about will be trying to articulate, this is what we should be aiming for, this is what we should be driving towards with our students. And for those of you who are students, you should be paying attention, because this is the kind of stuff that describes how people who find successful careers and successful ways to make impact in our civic world make a difference. So hopefully this will be helpful. And really the best place to start with this is with Rainbow Loom. How many of you remember the Rainbow Loom craze of a couple of years ago? How many of you participated in that? How many of you own the Rainbow Loom? Good. So rarely when I give this talk do I have those folks in the room. So here's how Rainbow Loom, so for those of you who don't remember, Rainbow Loom were these little plastic looms that had little pegs sticking up, and you took rubber bands and you used them to make bracelets and other kinds of things with them. If they were remarkable for nothing else, they got 10-year-old boys playing with pink rubber bands, which was a pretty remarkable accomplishment. Here's how they were described in the media. This is 2013, right before Christmas. Of all the new toys this year, this one looms large. Low tech but high on creativity, the Rainbow Loom has kids hooked. Spending hours after school and on weekends making bracelets, weaving together small, colorful rubber bands on a simple plastic room. So the subtext of a lot of the news reporting about this was like, finally we got those kids off their damn cell phones. That was sort of the main thrust of what the media was reporting about us. That finally we were doing something, they weren't playing with their PlayStations or their computers or whatever else. They were sitting on their little shag rug carpets with their little plastic looms, making bracelets, sharing them, trading them, starting small businesses with them, whatever else. All of that, to some extent, is totally true. But it actually also misses a really important media component of this activity. So this is a YouTube video by a pair of girls named Ashley and Steph. It's called How to Make a Rainbow Loom Starboard Bracelet. The last time I checked a couple of months ago, it had been viewed 30 million times. Now, I'm not saying that 30 million people watch this video. My guess is about 300,000 people watch this video 100 times, because it's really hard to make one of these bracelets. But some large number of people watched this film. And in fact, watching these kinds of films was absolutely essential to playing with and participating with Rainbow Loom. Rainbow Loom, the opportunities there were too rich and too complex for communities of people by themselves in their own small towns to be learning how to take most advantage of it. The way people played with Rainbow Loom was that you did some stuff on your loom on your own, and then you went on YouTube and you watched videos of other people, and then you took pictures of what you were doing and posted it on the Facebook accounts that you weren't supposed to have started yet, and shared those ideas with your friends and put them on Craigslist or on other things to be able to sell them with their friends. Media was essential to the ways that people played and participated with Rainbow Loom, and it's representative of what I think is one of the coolest parts of the time that we get to live through, which is, to some extent, this is the best time that it has ever been in world history to be a learner. Just about anything that you can think of to learn, including taking little rubber bands and knitting them together on a plastic loom, anything that you're interested in learning, there are thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people online who are super excited to learn about that with you. who are super excited to join in a community of folks sharing and exchanging knowledge. There's sort of nothing, what's wonderful about Ashley and Steph is in some ways, they're terrific educators, but there's nothing special about them. They're two girls from the heartland of the United States who have this shag rug carpet that looks a little bit like the one that was in my grandmother's living room. They made this very simple but extremely well-produced media. They take the rainbow loom, they put it on the ground, they set up a camera so that it doesn't move. When they're doing things that are really complicated, they move really slowly through it and talk you through it carefully. When you get to the boring parts where you're doing the same stitches over and over again, they speed it right up. But these girls with a handful of video have literally taught millions of people, and there are millions of learners that are out there across the world who wanted to join them in this community of people who are super excited to learn about Rainbow Loom. One thing that I think is really fun about this is if you go to the official sort of Rainbow Loom video channel, they have a Starburst bracelet video as well, and it has maybe 3 or 4 million views on it. So there are, something like 8 to times as many people who would rather learn how to make this from Ashley and Steph than from the actual company that makes the Rainbow Loom toy, which I think is terrific. The possibility that any of us could be, it's very unlikely that any of us are going to make a YouTube video that has 30 million views, but it's extremely likely that all of us can create some kind of media that we can share with the world. Anything that you want to learn, there are communities of people out there to help you teach and learn that. Whether you want to learn how to brew beer, how to write poetry, how to program computers. I don't know if folks heard about this guy, Julius Yego, who's a Kenyan, and he's a field athlete. So Kenyans are extremely well known for their success in running and track events, but he actually is the Commonwealth world record holder in javelin throwing. There are no javelin coaches in Kenya. You literally learn how to throw a javelin by watching YouTube videos. People becoming world-class athletes by having their coaches be other people who are out there sharing with them online. One of the things that I've been working on for the last couple of years are one form of universities sharing widely with one another classes that are called Massive Open Online Courses, or MOOCs. This is another venue for people to teach and learn with one another. But I think one of the things that we're learning too is that the nature of learning environments are shifting around us. Here's something that I learned. We did an interview study with about 100 folks who had taken courses through HarvardX. And one of the things that they told us was that the courses that they took were never the sole source of information about a topic for them. So we have this model, from the medieval era, from 1,000 years ago, about what a course is supposed to be. And there's supposed to be some person who's a professor or a teacher who's kind of a font of knowledge, and they have some resources, they have some books or other things like that. The original university courses were basically exercises in copying books. And our vision is that the course sort of contains all of this knowledge in it. It's sort of the one source of knowledge. But if you talk to people who are taking online courses, that's not how they imagine their learning experiences anymore. So someone might sign up for a course like the Einstein Revolution on HarvardX, but anytime they encounter anything they don't know, they're going to Google and they're looking up those ideas in search engines. For any kind of basic concept, they're going to Wikipedia and they're trying to figure out sort of what people have written about some of these underlying concepts. They're buying books. They're going to Google Books Preview and reading for free introductions and parts of books they can get access to. They're going to Facebook and they're joining groups of people who are also learning around the same topic. The course, which the professors might imagine as sort of the whole experience, is actually just one node in a larger network of learning experiences. And a huge part of what students have to do as learners and what we have to do as educators is help people figure out how they're going to transverse those nodes and how they're going to move throughout those networks. That our courses need to stop being the sort of sole container of information or knowledge or skills and competencies about a topic, and it needs to be an invitation for people to enter these wider networks of teaching and learning. Because, and the reason why all this is so important is that it's a wonderful thing that there's more opportunities for learning than ever before. And part of why that's so wonderful is there's more need and demand for learning than ever before. So a century ago, we would imagine people's educational experience as starting in grammar schools when they were 5 or 6 years old and continuing maybe through high school, maybe through college, for a handful of people longer than that. But there was this sort of notion that for the first 20 or 25 years of your life, you were a student, and then for the rest of your life, you were in a profession and you practiced that profession. That's the case for almost no one anymore. We're constantly reinventing the work that we do. We're constantly reinventing the jobs that we take on. We're constantly reinventing our practices. So learning is no longer something that happens in a defined early chunk of our lives. It's something that we're all doing throughout our lives. We had a meeting here in Cambridge a couple of months ago that was sponsored by the National Science Foundation, and we were talking about what colleges of the future needed to be able to do. And almost universally, very different people from very different backgrounds came up with two kinds of things. Is that one, that people needed to leave higher education with a specific set of skills that they could do right now, a trade or a job that they could practice when they leave. But there was a sense that almost anything that we could train people to do would become irrelevant 6 or 7 years after we trained them to do it. So we also had to prepare them to be lifelong learners. We had to prepare them to be able to relearn new crafts and new practices over time throughout their lives. Traditionally, we've had two separate educational systems for doing that. We've had a vocational, technical, training educational system to prepare people for jobs right now, and we've had a liberal arts system to prepare people for learning across the lifespan. Increasingly, those two things need to be fused together. Let me talk about the characteristics that I think are going to dominate the kinds of things that young people need to be able to learn and need to be able to do in their lives ahead to be successful in these kinds of changing worlds. And in particular, talk about the ways I think computers and artificial intelligence and technology is changing the kind of expectations we have for human beings and for learners. If you wanted to read one paper from this, if there's one homework assignment I could give you walking away from this, it would be to read a report called Dancing with Robots. It's written by two economists. One here is a guy named Frank Levy, and another one who's at the Harvard Graduate School of Education named Richard Vernane. And these guys, in my mind, have captured how the world of work is changing, how our civic sphere is changing, and how the ways we educate young people needs to change along with it. And one of my favorite ways to illustrate their ideas is by talking about on-demand hot water heaters. So I'm really glad there's some people from White River Junction here, because I own a cabin in Barnard, Vermont, which is by Silver Lake State Park in the Upper River Valley. And about 27, 28 years ago, my mom bought it and was looking in the phone book of the sort of Upper River Valley, White River Junction phone book for a plumber in Barnard, and found a guy named Dan Masterson. So Dan, can you come in and put a new hot water heater in? Dan comes in, sets it up with a really nice regular boiler hot water heater. My mom passed away a few years ago. The house passed down to my brother and I. We go to the phone book, try to find a plumber to help us put in a new hot water heater. And the plumber in Barnard that everyone uses is this guy named Dan Masterson, who is still practicing as a plumber 30 years later in Barnard. And we decide, since we're not there that often, what we want to get is one of these fancy new on-demand water heaters. So he installs the whole thing, puts it in, has it look real nice. And again, Dan has been practicing plumbing now for 30 years, and Dan walks us into the boiler room. It's not actually this. This is a random picture off the internet. But he walks into this, and our version of a hot water heater has a little display, a little LED display on it. He walks in, and Dan says, I want you to come look at this. See this display there? It says good, right? So 4 little LED letters, good. They say, okay, if it says good, then everything's working, don't worry about it. What should we do if it doesn't say good? Well, if it doesn't say good, I want you to flip open this panel, and I want you to push this button that says reset. Like, all right, I can do that. And then he said, well, all right, so what do we do if the reset button doesn't work? And he says, well, you see this little switch up here? This is the power switch for it. If you push reset and it still doesn't say good, then flip the power off and turn it back on. And I said, okay, we can do that too. And he said, all right, well, what if that doesn't work? And he says, well, there's one plumber in the entire Upper River Valley who's flown to Scandinavia to get the training to reprogram your hot water heater. And if it still doesn't say good when you do those two things, I'll give you that guy's name and you can call him. So the idea, when Dan Masterson 35 years ago was apprenticing as a plumber, he probably wasn't imagining that he needed to be a computer programmer as well. But all across the spectrum of employment, all across the trades that we participate in, all across the professions, the cognitive demands of the work that we participate in is constantly growing. And part of what's driving these changes has to do with what computers are able to do for us and what they're not able to do for us. Computers are particularly good, for the most part, at one kind of task. If you were to summarize the kinds of tasks that computers are good at, you would say they're really good at routine tasks. They're really good at anything that we can turn into a series of if-then-do statements. And there's a whole series of computer programmers who are spread throughout universities like this, who are trying to take tasks that we used to think of as really ill-structured, complicated tasks, and to make them routine tasks. One of my favorite examples is dermatology. So dermatology is something that we think of like, that's a pretty difficult profession. That's something that requires some highly specialized skills. Turns out a lot of what dermatologists do during their day is you sort of walk up to a dermatologist and say, I have a bump on my arm. Is this a good bump or a bad bump? And then dermatologists look at it and they have in their head a sort of bank of what do good bumps look like and what do bad bumps look like. And they sort of look at it and go, based on my sort of experience and understanding, I would call that a good bump. You can go back home. So there are people who are making iPhone apps where you would hover your iPhone on top of that bump, and programmed into that iPhone are thousands and thousands and thousands of pictures of bumps that are labeled as good bumps and bad bumps. And so instead of using the kind of ill-structured expertise of the doctor, instead what we can use is essentially a set of patterns that say, it turns out that good bumps and bad bumps, if you're able to break down the image into sort of a digitized mathematical vector, we can say, well, some of them are mathematically good bumps and some of them are mathematically bad bumps. And it turns out that we can take what used to be this kind of intuitive, judgment-based process and turn it into a series of routines. If your bump if your digitized bump has mathematical characteristics similar to good bumps, then we're going to send you home. If it has one similar to bad bumps, then we're going to cut it off right there, which we don't yet have robots who will be doing the cutting, but we're not too far away from that either. So there are two kinds of things that computers are actually still pretty lousy at, and conceivably will be lousy at for a long time. And those are the kinds of things that we should be teaching human beings to do. Anything that a computer can do, it will do less expensively than we can, and we won't be able to pay people a living wage to do it. But there are two kinds of things that computers don't do really well. The first are tasks that are ill-defined. Solving problems where we don't understand the problem real well, where we don't understand what kind of data is needed, what kind of evidence is needed to solve the problem, where we don't know what the solution looks like in advance. Those problems are called ill-structured problems, and solving those problems requires what you might call expert thinking. We also have found that computers tend to be pretty lousy at communicating with humans. There's some kinds of very structured communications that they can do. The last time you went to an airport, I presume 99% of you checked in through a kiosk. We used to have human beings having those conversations, but those conversations were extremely routine. What's the name of the city you're going to? Do you have a ticket? Do you have your bags? Did you pack your bags yourself? Have they been in your possession the whole time? We can turn those highly structured communications into communications that are mediated by computers and kiosks and robots and that kind of things. Complex communications, we can't. And one of the things that human beings will do for the foreseeable future, for the decades ahead, is any kind of work that requires persuasive, complex communication. Computers are usually laughably bad at trying to do these sorts of things. So a couple of years ago, there's some editors at the web magazine Boing Boing that noticed that there were a couple of companies that were experimenting with AI telemarketing. So all of you have made a phone call to a company. And had that company answer with a robot. This was a company that was trying to have robots call you and convince you they were humans. And they just have these kinds of they just have these kinds of awkward pauses and incorrect questions and incorrect responses. And the Boing Boing folks started discovering that one of the most effective questions they could ask to out these telemarketing robots were things like, what's the main ingredient in tomato soup? And then the robots calling you would say things like, "I'm sorry, our connection's not so good," or other things like that to sort of dissuade you from that. So complex communication, the kind of work you all do, is something that human beings are going to be better at least for the foreseeable future. Here are a couple of ways. Here's a couple pieces of evidence that sort of describe why these changes in the labor market are so significant. So here are a couple of guys. This is from work by a guy named David Deming, who's an economist at Harvard, sort of updating work from some of these guys here. And they break work up into 4 categories. Things that are routine tasks, things that are service tasks, but things that any human being can do and we usually pay people minimum wage for. Things that require non-routine analytical skills, and they focus specifically on math, and things that require social skills. And on the x-axis is the sort of from 1990 to 2012, and on the y-axis is the change in the distribution of these jobs since 1980. And what you can see is that jobs that require routine skills are disappearing from the workforce. Jobs that require math and social skills are the growing part of the workforce. Also, these service industries are a growing part of the workforce, but the problem with them is that they pay $7.25 an hour or whatever our legally mandated minimum wage is. Here's another way of doing a sort of cross-cut at this. So as you all young people are thinking about the kinds of things you want to do for the rest of your lives, this is sort of useful information to have. So on the x-axis are jobs that require social skills. Here's high social skills and low social skills. Here are things that require math or other kinds of ill-structured problem solving or that don't require those kinds of things. The jobs that are growing as a proportion of the labor market are in green. The jobs that are disappearing as a proportion of the labor market are in pink. And what you can see is that all of the jobs that are, all of the jobs that are growing are in this social skills category, and most of them are in this social skills and math category. And the things that are disappearing are the things that don't require those same level of social skills. One of the ways that you can think about your job as an educator, or the best way to position yourself for the future as a young person, is that we want to be helping young people develop the skill sets that computers can't do. Any of the things that computers can do, which tend to be things that can be broken down to routines, those are the jobs that are going to be disappearing. It's going to be things that require ill-structured problem solving and things that require complex communication. That will be a growing part of the labor market. Here's one that's straight up terrifying. So these are truck drivers. There are 3.5 million truck drivers in America. There are about 350 million Americans, period. 1% of Americans are truck drivers. Truck driving is one of the, one of the most important ways in the United States that we have people who don't have college educations earn a middle-class income. There are enormous companies that are devoted to ending the job truck driver. We think of it now as a job that's non-routine, that requires making split-second decisions about moving vehicles and making choices and driving and all that kind of stuff. But Uber is this enormous company with billions of dollars to spend. This sort of matchmaking service of having you find people who want to drive your cars is sort of version 1 of them. Version 2 of them is getting rid of the people altogether, is taking all the cars and making them able to drive themselves. Now, in some cases, this is going to be totally cool, and we're going to be sitting in the back of robot cars that are actually all like RVs, and we'll be playing video games in the back, and that'll be nice, except for the millions and millions of Americans who make a living driving. Uber recently went to Carnegie Mellon and basically bought their entire robotics department, which is the best robotics department in the world. There are enormous numbers of people who are working on the task of taking ill-structured jobs like truck driving them and making them routine. The best way you can summarize what they're doing is they're basically building digital train tracks on every road in America. You won't be able to see these digital train tracks because they exist in a computer system, but we're basically going to put all of the trucks on digital rails and have them drive that way. Think there are 3 million kids in the American school system right now who 40 years ago would have gone on to be truck drivers, and who we have to find, we have to develop different skill sets and companies and find different employment for in the future. Here's a gut check, and ask your students about this. Examine the kind of homework that typically gets sent home to you. Examine the gazillions of worksheets that are being piped back, and ask yourself these questions. Is the homework that you're giving your students, is the homework that you're taking home for your teachers, is it preparing you, is it letting you practice solving ill-structured problems? Is it letting you practice complex communication? Or is it asking you to do the kinds of routine tasks that you will never be paid to do in your lifetime? Now, probably there's some fraction of homework that should ask students to do routine things because they free up our minds to do other kinds of things. But my sense is if you look at the proportion of homework that gets sent home to kids, almost 100% of what we ask students to do is basically prepare to do jobs that no longer exist. How many of you have seen the movie Most Likely to Succeed? I have nothing to do with this movie, but I'm going to plug it because I think it's a great thing to look at. It's about this school in California called High Tech High. And High Tech High, I think, is the best. If I could take one high school in the country and pop it down in my neighborhood, you should turn your windows off, can you? That's my brother, by the way. He's probably going to complain about the house in Vermont. But it's because he broke it. It's not going to be Vermont kid. That's right. I was saying something about Most Likely to Succeed. It's about this incredible high school. One of the fascinating things about this high school is they're absolutely devoted to preparing people, and they're really about ill-structured problem solving and communicating. So what are the ideas, what are the pedagogies, what are the practices that are going to help them get really good at those kinds of things? And we have some of them. And for the most part, they're not going to be implemented in the core curriculum because for the next decade, at least, the core curriculum is overstuffed. There's too much junk that's already in there. It's going to be the people that are working at the periphery that are making the most powerful impacts on students' learning experiences. There's a guy who worked in the building over at the Media Lab starting 40 years ago. His name was Seymour Papert. He wrote a language called Logo. Just about any of us who have ever done anything in with computers in classrooms have knowingly or not been influenced by his work. And I'll leave you with this thought, which is that he predicted decades ago that two things are going to happen when computers enter schools. And one possibility is that kids will learn how to program computers, and the other possibility is that computers are used to program kids. We spend way too much time in schools using computers to program kids, and not nearly enough time helping kids program computers. And I think Seymour literally meant teaching kids how to program, but I would actually sort of take it one step further and to say, we're spending way too much time using technology to shove ideas into kids' heads when what we really ought to be doing with technology, with media, with animation, with programming design is figuring out how we get ideas out of kids' heads and into the world. So that's the work that I think we'll all be doing today. I'm really grateful for the chance to get you warmed up and excited to do it. So thank you.
Justin, will you take any questions?
I'll do whatever you want. You just tell me when to pull the hook. And, if a student has a question, they get one first. Adults have to wait. All right, we'll take one for everyone. You're a student too.
We're all students.
Yeah, you're more bearded than the others.
We're all media makers. We're really lashed into what you're talking about in terms of getting ideas out of our heads into the world. Can you kind of do a riff on that a little bit?
I'm getting ideas out of kids' heads.
We have an idea in our head, we want to communicate. We're making media to do so. What's some opportunities for kids to do that?
To me, I think one thing that's really important is trying to connect the work that students are doing in their core and disciplinary subjects with that work. To be able to say, your English teacher is making you write an essay, and your science teacher is making you write a lab report, and the media work that you're doing here expressing ideas, those kinds of things are all connected. And going back to English teachers and saying, that actually, like, if we can help students storyboard news stories, then that's helping them develop the skill sets to write and think as well. Here's one thing that's really interesting. My wife is a professor here in the Department of Material Science, and probably basically none of us could read the papers that she writes. They're all these kind of impenetrable things, and if you read them, you're like, wow, this is a bunch of like impenetrable technical language. If you were to talk to her and her students about what they think about when they write these super technical papers, they ask the question, what's the story here? What's the story that we're trying to tell through this science narrative? Who are the protagonists of the same? I was just talking to this guy, Bruce Schneider, who's a super famous crypto security writer. He writes in the popular press all the time. He's usually writing about what the NSA is doing and all that kind of stuff. And again, it's the same kind of question, even in that really technical writing, is what's the story here? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? What's the exciting change that's happening? What's the action? What's the conflict resolution? Even people who are writing sort of impenetrable technical papers around here are still thinking about trying to frame their work in terms of stories about how the world is changing. And so for those of you who are interested in science as well as interested in media, it's the same kind of thing. Anybody else? Other questions that folks have or thoughts or things you thought were ridiculous and wrong? Let me know.
I have one thing about I saw the Google car up in Silicon Valley a little while ago. And, they had a problem with that because in Boston, for instance, people double park and the car wouldn't go over the double line. And I thought that kind of spoke to your, the limitations of the computer and the thinking needed to know that if a car is double parked in the road, yeah, you can move around the double line.
You have to, yeah, that's a moment that you sort of break those rules. We're still going to be able to, one way to say that is to say, oh, there's a gazillion of these sort of careful, intuitive judgments we make. The other way to think of that is like, someone just hasn't programmed that rule into the computer yet. And pretty much actually like, part of why driving works is because how can you have millions of people, in 2-ton steel husks moving at 65 miles an hour? And it's because we all ultimately behave in pretty predictable kinds of ways. Actually, the first Google vehicles have driven like 1.2 million miles or something like that. They got their first ticket the other day. A car was pulled over for going too slow. But I think people who work in AI make judgments about lots of all of it is about forecasting sort of change. And man, vehicles and driving really seems like one that sort of in our lifetime, AI researchers are going to have solved. And we're going to have a fleet of cars that's driving that. And to some extent, like lots of technology innovations, it's going to bring all kinds of great things into society. It could make our use of fossil fuels substantially more efficient if none of us ever own a car, if there's the great algorithm of the sky that's sort of moving people where they want to go. But one of the things that AI researchers are trying to do is to take jobs that we thought were non-routine and to make them routine and to fire the people. And we need to be thinking about then, for all those 3.5 million kids who are in schools right now, who in another generation would have gone on to be truck drivers, what are they going to do, and how are we going to give them the skill sets to be able to do that successfully? One of the things that, I think there are lots of folks who have predicted that computers will become increasingly good at impersonating humans in communication, and that's something I think we're much, much further away from. I think we're basically still really, really lousy at that, because humans are enormously sophisticated at detecting, phoniness in other entities that they interact with. And so that's, I think, a pretty safe place to keep kids working for a while.
I had two quick comments. One is just a follow-up on the car and truck thing. A lot of these incredible technologies, I couldn't have, I would always say, there's no way that a computer could, can do this. Can't do what I do when I'm driving, I wouldn't trust it. But I've changed my opinion on it. Basically, I think that the new technology is going to save us from our current technology. Because if anyone drives along and stops and looks around them, what you're seeing people doing while they're supposed to be driving their cars is so scary. It's not going. We're not going back. It's just going to get worse. It's the same with pilots. It's too easy and too boring and too routine. So people that have a cell phone in one hand and an iPad in the other, I would rather have the computer or the robot doing it than those people. I really would. So that's one comment. The other one is, you said about Deerfield Academy and the ability, for a couple $100 to communicate with anyone in the world. It reminded me of a conference that I went to here probably 25 years ago when I taught in Boston. It was at the MIT Media Lab, and there were these incredible demonstrations. And then there was one graduate student who had set up a local network, local area network in a neighborhood, a dangerous neighborhood in Dorchester that he came from, and the goal was just to set up sort of like a bulletin board for that neighborhood to work on that neighborhood. And I think even from the aspect of radio, we may have an audience all over the world, but I think what we're missing is the local audience and building the communities that way. I think that's an important kind of notion.
That's great, and you don't have to build the local area network anymore.
No, I actually got a license up in Lynn through the FCC, one of those low-power licenses. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the school to go along with it, but it would have been awesome. It would have been just like that, you know?
Great. Good. Oh, one more over here. Yeah.
I'm coming from like the background of the arts into this, and when you were breaking down that it's engineering, technology, and the arts and stuff that are being more of the application rather than the facts. However, I'm slowly getting into coding. The reason why I wanted to be in the arts as a kid was because I didn't have to do the math or the science classes. And now, even as an artist, I'm learning HTML, I'm learning CSS, and all this front-end development stuff. So, looking at what this information is showing about where computers lack in that expert thinking and complex communication, do you think that if there's a marriage between the arts and the way that we view technology today, could the arts in fact scaffold that expert thinking and that complex communication that we aren't getting from computers?
Yeah, or I would say it's the kind of domain where students solve some of the problems that they're most interested in. That you're, in so many other subjects, you're solving problems that have already been tackled before and already been resolved before. But all the time in the arts, we're saying, no one has ever expressed what I feel in this way before, and I'm the only one who can do that. No one else can make a representation of whatever this is from my perspective anymore. And again, I think the arts teacher point to us like, there used to be pretty good business in realistic portraiture, which isn't as strong anymore because we invented these other devices, which can capture certain kinds of reality, perfectly. But for the foreseeable future, we're not going to have computers who can design front ends of websites that can perform the way we want to, or to create the kinds of experiences that we want people to have. And so I think, and the arts are another place in our curriculum that aren't stuck. They are another place in our curriculum that aren't overstuffed with a couple centuries of expectations of stuff that people need to know. So they're great places to challenge people to solve problems. Well, it's super nice to be able to hang out with you this morning. I hope you all have a terrific day. There's still
Yes, I have one more. Thank you very much. Okay, so this last slide here that we're looking at, this is very important because this is actually happening now to our students. Computers will be used to program kids. Think about that. Think about what's happening in our classroom now, especially within the inner city. And kids can barely hang on because computers are used to program kids. Imagine what's going to happen in 10, 20 years from now.
And we actually have really strong evidence that the way that we use computers in different communities reflects these other continuing inequalities. So for instance, in 2012, a whole bunch of students took the National Assessment of Educational Progress, a test in math, and we interviewed those students and said, what kinds of things are you doing in computers in math class? And the lower income neighborhood you come from, if you're a member of an underrepresented minority, you're much more likely to be using computers and mathematics for drill and practice, where if you're good at math, you're affluent, you're white, you're much more likely to be asked to use computers for simulations, for critical thinking kinds of exercises, for creating things. And so even when we can take the exact same device and distribute it to every kid in Massachusetts, and that wouldn't be creating inequality, because it's not the distribution of access that matters, it's the distribution of usage. It's the kinds of opportunities that people from different communities have to be able to use these kinds of tools. And it's and I think I would probably disagree with Seymour Papert. Like there probably are, I have a 5-year-old daughter, and one day I would like her to learn her times tables, and I would like her to have memorized them, because it's kind of silly when you're trying to do calculus one day to be like, so what is 3 times 4 again? And if there's a computer program that can shove that into her head faster than a teacher can, like I don't actually have any problem with that. But I think we need to be very thoughtful about, there are a lot of young people whose only experience with computers is getting stuff shoved into their head, and that's tragic. Because especially since we know that there's no one who's ever going to get a job that requires you to answer the kinds of problems that computers can assess. What we need to do is to be using computers to get ideas out of kids' heads. What do you think, Alan? Should we let folks go on to the next thing?
Yeah. Joe, do you have one quick?
It's not quick, unfortunately. One of the big questions you're talking about has to do with the anthropology of ideas. counterbalance, Boston and MIT were the foundation for Ford Motors, people don't remember that. But now it's Stanford. Why isn't our culture of the East Coast keeping up?
No, I mean, our culture is keeping up in different, we're absolutely just as much as here.
Started here, and then moved to California.
Yeah, so there's some cool things that happen in California, but the biotech industry here is pretty awesome. There's plenty of startup infrastructure that's here. I don't know, I refuse to yield Boston's business. You're gonna have to find someone else to tell you that we're not the hub
Well,
of
why
the
are our
universe.
schools, why are our schools look like that?
So actually, the other thing is that most schools in California don't look like theirs either. There's a great book actually by a guy, Larry Cuban, maybe the best historian of education, where he did some research around schools are in Silicon Valley and their use of computers, and his sort of summary of the argument was the title of his book, which was Oversold and Underused. That they didn't really necessarily make a difference. But in Philadelphia, we have Tech Boston Academy. In Philadelphia, we have Science Leadership Academy. There's awesome stuff that's happening in Boston too. We have worse weather.
Well, I think I should thank Justin.